Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in another spectacular example of Brexit being the beast that eats its own children, the Financial Times have reported on research carried out at Warwick University showing how areas that were big supporters of Brexit have also been hit the hardest. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So when it comes to voting through the various stages of Brexit, there are essentially two levels of self-defeat here now. The first is simply the fact that joining the European community was done from Britain's point of view, not for the peace project, but for the economic gains. So when you reverse a measure that was taken for economic benefit, it stands to reason that you will also reverse the consequences as well. And what does a stunted economy mean for the general population? Fewer jobs, fewer reasonably well-paid jobs as well. But this research shows that the economic consequences of Brexit have not just hit everyone, they have hit everyone, but they have hit hardest those areas that voted for it by hefty margins. I mean, I knew some odd examples, some of them really stuck in because, for example, when it comes to Brexit debates, there are three parts of the economy that get discussed over and over again, more than any other. That's car manufacturing, fishing and farming. All three industries were told that they would prosper when we left the EU, and all three are now in existential peril. Now, there had already been announcements of closures in car manufacturing, for example, in the UK, some of which, and these are guaranteed, some of them are still holding on. A number of them have just made their decisions, that's it, we're gone. Some of them will take effects next year, some it'll be 2022, I believe. Grimsby, which is a main fishing town in this country where I lived for over a decade, has cheekily asked for special terms to protect their economy, which is highly dependent upon the fishing industry, from the hard Brexit that they supported. And farmers are now turning on to the fact that Brexit is going to completely shaft them good and hard. The ones that didn't know this before, I'm not saying they were all idiots or ignorant about how their own business works, but the ones who believed the government lies are now turned on to the fact that, oh, hang on a minute, what's going on? And yet all of the areas that rely heavily on these industries, these aspects of the economy, supported Brexit in 2016, and many of them, particularly on the car manufacturing and the fishing front, in resolutely Labour voting constituencies until last year when a lot of them basically voted Conservative MPs in for the first time. Now, there is a twisted irony to this as well, because the Conservatives under Boris Johnson, if I'm honest, seem genuinely intent on retaining these former Labour seats come the next general election. They're not just seeing it as, oh great, we've got a load of power now. They seem to actually want to keep them next time round. In fact, I'm quite sure that the MPs in those areas definitely want to retain those seats. The trick to this, according to Boris Johnson, is to make sure that these areas get real investment. Real investment in the local infrastructure, get economies building. Now, the Prime Minister has said multiple times that these so-called red wall seats have just been borrowed. He accepts that himself. We've just borrowed these seats, and what he needs to do to keep them is to level up their economies, is how he calls it. Level up their economies in order to hold them. Absolutely, I agree with that. But boosting the economies of towns outside of the southeast of England is not generally a priority for Conservative governments. But if they actually intended to invest in infrastructure, in my neck of the woods, for example, I said at the time, I'm not actually going to complain where that investment comes from, as long as it's legal, of course. But here's the thing. These are poor parts of the country. And the problem is that even if Boris Johnson is true to his word and actually invests as he said he would, it might still not boost these local economies. The research shows that these areas have already taken a beating since the Brexit vote. All areas have, but these ones particularly so. And of course will continue to do so. And then there's the pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic has not helped either. It noted that these areas also had the highest proportion of workers on furlough. Now, to me, that brings two things immediately to mind. First of all, so furloughed workers are obviously at risk of never going back to work. the longer workers are off, the more likely companies have to scale back the number of employees they had. Some companies, of course, are also just looking at their staffing and thinking, do you know what? We can use this as an excuse to get rid of a load of people, efficiency savings and all that. And this has already happened with a lot of businesses. So an area that has a higher proportion of furloughed workers is likely to see a higher proportion of unemployment as a result of the pandemic. And these are areas which already had high unemployment. So the chances of these people being able to find a job anytime soon is much lower as well. And when unemployment is reported, it's always about the national figure, isn't it? But this is, for an individual, this is fairly worthless, because what we're interested in is the figure for our region, our local economy. So the government may release its fiddled figures and say that unemployment is really low, historically low, they may even say. But in your region, it could be catastrophically high. And the second thing that brought to mind was the disproportionate impact on the local economy. So furloughed workers, for example, are still getting paid, but only up to 80% of their wages. 80% of their wages was being paid by the public purse. It's now going down. Now, there were some companies that topped that up a little bit. Most did not. Most, to be fair, wouldn't have been able to afford to, because these workers aren't making anything for the company. So you've got workers already on 80% of their normal wages. And, you know, a lot of these workers are the sort of people who can't really save a lot anyway. So, and also they've got no job security. So, you know, any little luxuries they may have been buying would have been straight out as well if you were worried about your future employment prospects. Now, that obviously means you're not going to be spending as much in the local economy. Now, granted, some businesses wouldn't have been open for your money anyway. But even in terms of essentials, you know, goods and services would have seen less spending. And it also means, of course, with disproportionately lower productivity, because a greater proportion of furloughed workers means a greater proportion of businesses that had to go into lockdown, because not all businesses did, of course. That means less money for the local authorities in terms of business rates. So you end up with also disproportionately large deficits in the local authorities' budget. And, of course, nowhere near enough help from the government. The government say, of course, they're helping. They quote some figure as if it's a magical figure. It's a pathetic figure, you know. And then the government will use the situation to bash local councils, especially if they're Labour ones. Because, you know, when these councils are forced to cut services, which they have to do, the government will say, well, we gave them money. What are they doing with it? You didn't. You know, which heaps even more pain onto that area. So at this point, what you have is a Brexit supporting town that has already suffered a greater economic downturn since the fateful referendum in 2016, before the pandemic even began, being hit by above average unemployment from the pandemic as well, when they already had above average unemployment, less money to spend in the local area. So local businesses are hit and you get an even greater downturn, being an above average recipient of EU investment, which is now going to be reduced to zero because the government aren't saying that they're going to replace it with their own funding. And a no-deal Brexit waiting at the end of this year to completely knacker manufacturing, which these towns overwhelmingly rely upon. You know, to cap it all off just on that, the research noted that, you know, these are areas with relatively low skills, and so therefore it's not going to be easy to attract other industries to move into that area to take advantage of the large workforce, because it's a large unskilled workforce. And because those low-skilled, high manufacturing-dependent economies have been hit the hardest, and those are exactly the profiles of the main support for Brexit in the country, and those are exactly the areas that are going to be taking the biggest hit from a hard Brexit in particular. And just finally, I probably ought to add as well, because I know what always happens when I talk about anything like this. Some people will say, well, they voted for it twice, which they effectively did. They voted for Brexit in 2016, and then they voted specifically for the hard Brexit in 2019. You know, and you reap what you sow. Yeah, but it's not like they voted with one voice. You know, many of them voted against it, and they will suffer just as much. But it also has a wider impact as well because, you know, we are all connected. But what it means is that even if Boris Johnson was absolutely true to his word on wanting to level up these areas, and let's face facts, it would be the first time he's ever been true to his word with a political promise, then he will be skating uphill to achieve what he wants. And then you can't help but notice how he's gone about investing during the pandemic. So is he really even true to his word about levelling up the infrastructure? Because when we look at what he's done under coronavirus, wasting billions on contracts to wholly unsuitable private companies, many of whom haven't just not delivered good value, but haven't delivered at all. Some contracts cancelled without anything being produced. And speaking of that, that is a little bit of a clue as to the second video coming out today in a few hours. Until then, I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.